Okay, I want to continue the commentary or the twitching, as I kind of call it, on Peterson and Dillahunty after the first 30 minutes. There's kind of I did a framing video, which I'll put in the comments. I did part one, which I'll put in the comments, and now this will be part two. And what happens here is there's kind of a breath in the conversation, and Peterson began, as you'll see in part one, with trying to frame the phenomenology in his approach, which is different from Dillahunty's kind of materialistic objectivism. And the question, is there a God? Wondering about this ontology of God. Now, Dillahunty says, now we can't really know this, but, and this is where I think that position kind of creeps into pragmatism, because they say, well, we can't know if there's a God out there because he's buffered from us, he's separated from us. But what that means is he isn't functional. That you don't need this supernatural to actually have the world work. Our explanations for how the world works within a materialistic image is sufficient to understand how the world works. And Peterson disagrees. Peterson basically says, I don't think that perspective is sufficient. And so now there's kind of a breath in the conversation, and Peterson's going to take another run at it. And so here we go.
That's fine.
Let me ask you something about consciousness. You tell me what you think about this. Okay. All right. So this is how it looks to me.
And now this isn't keeping with phenomenology, because basically one of the critiques of materialism that phenomenology brings is that materialism is inadequate to explain consciousness. It can't explain our consciousness, and as I said in the last video, materialism can't really dispel the threat to it that the consciousness we are experiencing is illusory as compared to the story we're telling about it. In other words, Dillahunty wants to see God as an object, and we're having the debate whether or not you can have knowledge of that object, and the materialist basically says, no, we're cut off from the possibility of that. And in a sense, what phenomenology says is that, well, you're not only cut off from that, you're cut off from, little heart-shaped candies, and you're cut off from books, and you're cut off from cell phones, and you're cut off from lobsters, and that you can't really know these things, and you can't really know all that you purport to know. And so that's why Peterson is coming in here on consciousness.
I mean, there's lots of ways of thinking about how people interact with the world. But I think this is how we treat ourselves and other people as we see them acting in the world. And so I would say it's indicative of our deepest belief, because I think belief is associated with action.
So that's pretty much standard pragmatism.
So the way consciousness appears to me is that...
Well, before we get there, and again, if you look at the materialist conception, and I think Dillahunty's being honest, he's saying, okay, if there's a supernatural, we don't have any evidence for it. Now, again, I'm thinking about doing another video which would ask the question, well, what kind of evidence could you have for the supernatural? I mean, even that is difficult to conceive of, because a little bit later, Dillahunty is going to say, well, the laws of physics. Well, if you go back over the history of the laws of physics, what we find is that we have these laws of physics, and then we find things that don't fit, so we update our laws of physics. And so you have to begin to ask the question, well, what does that mean? And Dillahunty a little bit later will say things like, well, that, my way of thinking updates itself. Okay, fair enough, but so does the Latter-day Saints Church. And so do many churches. Churches are always updating themselves. Updating yourself is not necessarily a validation that you're on the right path. Sometimes when we update ourselves, we discover later that the update was a bad idea, and then we go back to what we had before. And so there's always that dynamic. So Peterson is basically saying the materialist conception of the world does not adequately take into account consciousness. And the reason we know that is because Materialists will say, well, maybe there is a God out there, but we can't know him, and we don't need to act as if there is. In fact, acting as if there is a God out there puts us on the wrong track. That's the materialist assertion. Now, Peterson will come back and say, okay, well, isn't the best indication of our beliefs our actions? And again, this is a common thing for preachers to say. Preachers will often tell their congregations, you're not acting as if you're Christian. You're not acting as if Jesus rose from the dead. You're not acting as if the Holy Spirit has come on you. You're not acting as if you have been saved in every way you can be saved by your Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. You are saying those things, but your life betrays something different. And you can, in fact, find criticisms like this throughout the Bible. And so what Peterson is saying, a la pragmatism, is that we act out our deepest beliefs. And if you want the truest indication of what someone believes, look at how they behave. In other words, actions express belief more truly than our words do. This is also in line with Jonathan Haidt's talk about the elephant and the rider, that essentially the elephant is what's guiding most of our actions. That's our unconscious self. And the rider on top is our public relations person who's creating ad hoc rationalizations and justifications about what the elephant has already decided to do. And if you read Jonathan Haidt's Happiness Hypothesis, or his later book, I forget the title of it, but the moral roots of right and wrong, I forget what it is, but I've read them both. They're both good books. They're both very well worth reading. But that's basically Haidt's argument, and Peterson falls into that and says, if you want to know what the person, which is the composite of the elephant and the rider, if you want to know what the person actually believes, watch the elephant. Don't listen to the rider. And I think right now, in terms of, if you listen to Scott Adams, for example, with respect to Donald Trump, Scott Adams will say, Donald Trump is a persuader. He's talking before the elections. He said, we're gonna all of those 11 million people here who are here illegally, they've got to go. They've got to go. Now, have we seen any action to round up 11 million people? Have we seen any attempts to ask Congress for the resources sufficient to kick out 11 million people? So Scott Adams would say, well, that's just Donald Trump talking. You've got to watch the elephant. And that's, in a sense, what Peterson is saying here. You've got to watch the behavior.
It's a faculty, let's say, that,
let's back it up a little bit.
To me, belief is associated with action. So the way consciousness appears to me is that it's a faculty, let's say, that confronts possibility. We'd call that possibility, well, sometimes possibility, sometimes we call it potential, like your potential. Sometimes we call it the future. So I don't see us as driven deterministically like clocks, which is apparently, I think, although I've been accused of misunderstanding Sam.
Now, before we get into the determinism, again, these are the two frames. Dillahunty says we are objects in space. That's what we are. Peterson says we are beings faced with potentiality, and it's action that creates that potentiality and drives us into the future. And again, these are the two frames. And my argument about what this conversation degenerated into is that they're not talking to each other. And again, I think Peterson sees Dillahunty's frame, but here's a fact about human beings. There's a lot going on this stage. We have our presuppositions. We frame the world in different ways. People don't ditch their frame quickly or willingly or easily, usually. Usually ditching your frame involves something as dramatic as a religious conversion or a deconversion. Because the thing is, these frames impact how you live your lives. And so you've got a lot invested in your frame. And so now Peterson is going to take another attempt to basically say, I think my frame tells a more accurate story about the world based on all the evidence. Not just evidence of seeing objects, but evidence how we actually live.
Sam Harris before, but I think that's the argument that he makes. I see us instead as agents confronting a landscape of possibility.
There it is right there. Agents confronting a landscape of possibility. That is Peterson's basic frame.
And that what consciousness does is enable us to shape that possibility into actuality.
Now, I've been talking about C.S. Lewis's miracles, okay? Consciousness allows us to shape this possibility into actuality. It's going to be interesting to see what the relationship of that is to, say, C.S. Lewis's reason. Because what phenomenology does, if you go back and look at Mark, I forget his name's videos about phenomenology, phenomenology is a lot about trying to articulate what reason is. And the relationship between phenomenology and mathematics, Husserl was a mathematician, is very tight. And, you know, I've mentioned Dallas Willard's work. I looked up Dallas Willard's kind of his main, the book that he spent his professional career on, not his career as a Christian thinker, but it was on logic and Husserl. It gets very deep into this idea of reason. Now, again, if we look at C.S. Lewis and reason and miracles, C.S. Lewis will argue that it is in fact reason that is the most intimate connection to the supernatural that we have. It is by reason that we transcend the natural. It's by reason that this computer is sitting in front of me and I'm talking into it, and we have this thing called the internet. It's by reason that I'm not just sitting naked in the woods. It's by reason that we have constructed this entire world, which we implicitly describe as being unnatural, and that we act as if it is not natural in terms of how many different things about our diet, how many different things about our actions. If we would say to someone, why don't you be natural? And by meaning that, tell them to take off all their clothes and go live naked on the Serengeti, and not with the cameras of Naked and Alone looking at you. We would say, I don't want to do this. I want to live in the world of civilization. And at the basis of civilization is this activity that we perform that we call reason. And in fact, the consequences of this reason are CO2 buildup in the atmosphere, are the agricultural revolution, are the scientific revolution, and all of this that has happened. And so that's where Peterson, that's not too far from Peterson's, we look at a realm of turning possibility into actuality.
And we do that with whatever it is that allows us to make decisions. I think that our legal system is basically predicated on the idea that that's true. I think that if you treat yourself that way, that works. I think if you treat other people as if that's their basic characteristic and perhaps their value, that you get along with them. And I think that if you organize your society on that presupposition, it appears to be functional. So what do you think about the idea of consciousness as confronting a landscape of possibility?
Okay, so a couple of things. What is Peterson doing here? He is saying, my framing of reality is bigger and deeper and further than yours. Now let's understand Dillahunty's calling in life. Dillahunty is a rationalist, materialist apologist, and he makes videos and he does a TV show or whatever he does. Again, I've got some links. I haven't had a chance to watch them yet. But he tries to convince everyone that his picture of the world is right. Now, okay, now what's the motivation behind this picture? What's the eschatological vision behind this picture? His idea is that if everyone will just see the world as I see it, then what? Well, then we won't have religion that we stumble over or religion that we fight over. Then, now we can't help but suspect that behind this there's a political motivation. Because as we saw in Richard Dawkins on Unbelievable with Justin Brierley, was that when Richard Dawkins was there, Richard Dawkins didn't mind the evangelical and the Jewish guy that were before him, because he said to them, well, you're reasonable, not like those people in Kansas who want to get evolution out of the textbooks and get rid of abortion, so on and so forth. So even, I would suspect that even lurking behind Dillahunty's calling in life is an eschatological vision of the world that he sees as being related to his vision of objects in space and cutting off any acting as if the supernatural is real, that somehow if this is adopted, then the world will straighten out. Now, Peterson is, in a sense, cutting ahead of him and saying, well, okay, you've got your vision and all of this, but let's talk to how we actually behave in the world, because how we actually behave in the world isn't really a lot like this modernistic frame that you're talking about, because people just simply ignore you. And one of the points that even the atheists make is whether they believe in God or don't believe in God, they keep acting the same way. And so in a sense, what Peterson is saying is that how we really act is a lot more like my frame of the world than your frame of the world. So he's just articulated this and kind of given it to Dillahunty and saying, here's my picture. What do you think of this? Now on one hand, that's really cool and really generous. Again, this is Peterson's picture of the world, that, okay, here's the materialists. They see objects, and Peterson say they're Newtonian. And when I talk about my natural supernatural video, I'm probably going to use, get a little bit into quantum, what quantum theory talks about in terms of what is real. But Peterson says, the materialists are living a fiction, and the fiction they're living is pretty much as much of a fiction as the religious people. And Peterson says quite rightly earlier, the fundamentalists and the atheists are really cousins in this. They are just articulating two sides of the same frame. And Peterson's saying, here is this bigger frame, and my bigger frame, I think, better understands and better articulates how we all actually behave. And your little frame over here of working on your materialist world is really in many ways inconsequential. Well, let's see what Dillahunty has to say.
Potential. Is there
Sure.
something?
So I don't know that I have that much of an issue with anything in particular that you've said. There's a number of different ways to frame these things so that people can have a better grasp on it. One of the things I know people struggle.
Now, that's an interesting response, because I don't know if Dillahunty actually understands what Peterson is trying to do here. Now, that's normal in a conversation. We often don't understand where the other person is coming from. And this is made tremendously more difficult because, again, let us not forget another frame that's here, that these two people are sitting on a stage in front of video cameras before an audience that very much has their own biases and wants winners and losers. And that very much impacts our ability to use reason to discern between these two people.
Struggle with is, and we may have to get back to this in a minute. I don't necessarily want to dig in on it just a second, but I would love to talk about it. This idea that absent a God, there's no moral authority. This is a fear that many people have.
See, and I think Dillahunty is back to his frame. And that's why, again, they're both... And someone in the comment section from the previous video said, well, why can't Peterson just talk about it like two frames? Well, I don't know if he sees it this way. I think he does. I got my take on Peterson from Peterson, but in a way, probably I would, if I were going to talk to Dillahunty, I would come with a little diagram and say, hey, here's two views of the world. I think you're talking this one, and I think Peterson's talking this one. How could the two of you, what kind of conversation could the two of you have to try to discern what you would like out of the conversation?
And when you're talking about viewing consciousness as the way you describe consciousness is what I would probably call our agency.
Okay.
And while I don't think that we have libertarian free will, I'm on record as being a compatibilist along with Dan Dennett. But I also had to read another.
Okay, so here we're trying to move towards each other. So let's imagine one view of the materialist conception is that we're looking at objects in space. Okay. That view emphasizes seeing more than doing. So now Dillahunty is saying, okay, well let's talk about doing. Well, one of the real issues with doing in a materialist world is, well, if everything is determined by the Big Show, that I am simply working out the physics that was launched in the Big Bang, and that's basic determinism. And one of the difficulties of determinism is we don't live this way. We don't think this way. Determinism itself is another strange story over here that when we look at it, we say, oh, if you go back to Thomas Nagel. So in past videos, I've brought up Thomas Nagel, and you can find a nice summary of this at the Weekly Standard, written a while ago, from his book Mind and Cosmos, which is a very worthwhile book to read. Thomas Nagel basically says this conception of the world is so foreign from us, it doesn't really work for us.
Clarify it because of that discussion. I'm fine with the idea that we have a will, that we have desires, that we are an agent that is also capable of self-reflection to see what are the consequences of my action moving forward. To me, it does not matter if that is ultimately deterministic, like clockwork, or if there was something that could trump determinism. Oh, I shouldn't have said Trump. I'm so sorry. If there was something that could actually overcome the deterministic view, that doesn't change to me the fact that you would be the agent responsible for your actions.
Now what's interesting in this argument is any conversation about determinism should also include determinism of thought and determinism of position. And so in a sense, we're responsible for it. So you want to be a compatibilist, okay, with respect to this. So we're responsible for it. We're not going to get rid of that. But it's also a little bit ironic to sit here and say, well, I'm going to try to argue with these people because I want them to see the world as I see it. But they're predetermined to believe or not believe. This isn't very different from many conversations within Calvinism about determinism and predestination and belief and election. And, there have been times when missionaries have gone overseas and other Calvinists have said, hey, if God wants to convert those people, he doesn't need you. And so this can go down all kinds. Determinist thinking gets very weird very fast and very much apart from how we normally behave.
Now, when my lawnmower acts up, I will sometimes anthropomorphically, cuss it out.
It's hard to get rid of those vestiges of religious behavior.
But yeah, it is. Touche. I mean, although at least I got rid of them.
I haven't seen you interact with your lawnmower yet.
And this is going to be a big deal because Peterson's thesis is basically, no, you act like God has been so deeply embedded into the ways that you act out. If your actions show what you believe, then you believe in God.
But at the end, I recognize that the lawnmower is not a thinking agent that is not making decisions. And so that difference between there is where I would inject the sort of ideas about moral responsibility. Sam and I had
the difficulty with the conversation about the lawnmower and thinking agents is that, in a sense, what materialism says is that we are finally no different from the lawnmower. Now, we are more complicated, but we have this illusion that we are thinking agents, but we're not really thinking agents. That I and the lawnmower are only separated by a degree of complexity, but not separated by a degree of kind. And that is what is at the root of C.S. Lewis's book Miracles. Because if I and the lawnmower are basically the same thing, and we are only separated by a degree of complexity, and we are not separated by a degree of kind, why should I treat the other person sitting on the stage as if they are a conscious being? And again, this gets back to Peterson's argument. Peterson is saying your system breaks down. You are the lawnmower. You're just a more complex lawnmower, and you're under the delusion that you have things like free will and agency. But you are fundamentally no different from the lawnmower. That, I think, is the materialist position, and this is why Peterson is attacking Dillahunty and will attack Sam Harris and will attack all of them and say, you don't believe in the world you say you believe. This is exactly what C.S. Lewis wrote in the book Miracles. And many, many others have had this critique of materialism, that you don't actually believe this world that you describe because all of your actions betray it. There it is. That's what's at the heart of this.
Sam Harris and I had an argument in Chicago about free will, and I was pointing out that he could walk over and step off the end of the stage, or I could pick him up and carry him and drop him off the stage, and at the end, the effect would essentially be the same. But the conflict between those two is everything that I describe as will, whether you want to call it free or not. I think that's what we value. That's what we care about.
Again, okay. So Sam Harris walking off the stage or Dillahunty carrying him off the stage, either of them is the basic mechanics of a lawnmower within the whole show. And you say, well, so which part of the lawnmower has will? The part that is, guiding one element of the system or another. Let's look at my dog. I play fetch with my little dog, and I throw something down the hall. And if you play fetch with a dog, you know how this goes. They grab whatever it is you threw. They bring it back to you. They get almost to you, and then they stop. And right there, they're thinking, should I give him the ball? But I don't want to give him the ball. So, okay, there is will. To whatever degree we call it free. But mechanistically, we would have to say within this worldview, well, it's just a computer program. But it's far more complex because it's between elements and it's between people. So again, this is why Peterson is saying your picture of the world, you can't live in your picture of the world, so you should get rid of it, and you should instead look at my picture of the world, that being, understanding it through the lens of consciousness, being is a forum where agents bring potential into possibility.
I would be responsible for that action. I would be acting in opposition to what the other agent wanted. And I don't know that you have to...
And there would be something hypothetically wrong about that.
Yes.
Okay. Right there. Peterson has jumped in, because what's Peterson thinking? Why did he bring in the ought? Because another problematic element of the materialist conception of the universe is ought. Because on one hand, ought always implies eschatology. It always implies a telos. It always implies, in a sense, a mind. And the problem with materialism is that there is no mind. There's the illusion of mind. There's the experience of mind. But without mind, you can't have ought, because ought involves will and telos and eschatology. And again, Peterson would say, even what we're doing right now here on this stage is so deeply embedded in ought and will and eschatology that your system cannot account for. You should give your system up. But he won't.
Okay, good. So that's close.
We can get to the morality thing, because I think the next question I had, unless you wanted to follow up on that, is a lot of, like I was saying earlier, it seems that you're talking a lot about, you haven't addressed the issue, and I'm not going to push back on it because I want to move on to some other stuff. Of whether or not there is good reason to believe there actually is a God, as opposed to whether there are good reasons for people to believe that there actually is a God.
Again, Dillahunty, this is his agenda. This is his frame. It's space and objects, and if there is an object called God. That's what he wants to know. And again, Peterson is like, doesn't make any difference if you don't act on it. And in a sense, Dillahunty says, well, that's right. I don't want people who believe in God to act on it, so I think I'm going to change their behaviors by getting them to no longer believe in this God, and that would be an upgrade. Okay, and then Peterson would say, well, an upgrade in what way? Well, because I think this ought to be the case. And then Peterson will say, aha, ought? Where do you get ought from?
And then it describes, there are people who believe, and then there are people who believe in belief, that there's value. And from what you said here and in some other...
Now, this actually is getting closer to Peterson, because again, as I laid out in the framing video, Peterson's God, I gave the example of the mistress. There's a woman who believes her husband is having an affair. She reads his texts, and let's say from a certain woman, and imagines that her husband is sleeping with this woman, and on the basis of this, she kills herself. Okay. Now let's suppose the husband did not sleep with this woman. Well, the mistress was real enough to prompt her to kill herself. Now we're getting into these two definitions of real. And again, I went all through this in the first framing video.
Comments, which I'm not going to saddle you with. I'm curious.
And so Dillahunty wants to know, okay, Peterson, this is a good question. Is this an ontological God, the kind that I want to have the conversation about this? Or is this merely a functional God that helps people believe better because, and this is an interesting thing to think why he thinks this differentiation is important. Because again, if you go back and you look at the heretic piece, what if Christians are better behaved people if they believe there is a God? And this gets into the metaphorical truth that Brett Weinstein was talking about in the Joe Rogan with the porcupine. What if people are safer imagining that porcupines can throw their quills? Are you better to allow that erroneous but metaphorical truth? Is the world better? But now, again, when you enter into that question, you're asking for better, and now Peterson will say, but underneath that is the assumption that better means people live longer, or better means more people live. That's your assumption you're sneaking in.
Irrespective of whether there's a God, what is it that you fear we would lose if people stopped believing that there was a God, or believing there was value in believing?
And that's a good question, because again, a lot of Peterson's mission is to say we will lose Western civilization if we try to rip God out of it.
We'd lose the metaphoric substrate of our ethos.
But he says it in a pretty abstract way. We lose the metaphysic substrate of our ethos. Okay, well, metaphysic. Well, what is metaphysic? That's beyond physics. Substrate, what is that? That's the foundation of our ethos. What is that? Our ethics, that which motivates us to behave properly. We would lose, so again, Peterson is laying his cards on the table in rather abstract language. He's saying here, we would lose this thing that we possess, which is metaphysical, these thoughts that we have that are the foundation for how we behave. And again, this is the argument he's making, that Matt Dillahunty, Sam Harris, this is so built into how we act at a level far deeper than we can articulate, that if we continue to try to rip this out, we will cut the branch off that we're sitting on. We will poison the well that we're drinking from. We will destroy this amazing society that we possess. That's his answer. Now, you might, well, why did you say that, Paul? Well, I'm a pastor. What do pastors do? We take this crazy book and we try to break it down to people and explain it in simple terms. I'm a sheepdog.
And we'd be lost.
And so I think
Nietzsche
an
was
uneducated.
right about that.
So I really want to know, and I'm not
Yeah.
being a dick. I
Yeah,
want to
yeah.
know what you mean by metaphorical substrate.
Now, what's also interesting is that if you look at this video, even from a position of watching body language, from tone of voice, you can hear in this moment, and we all pick up on it. We might not be conscious of it, but our watchers know it, and we feel it because our watchers are also sending us messages through our feelings. We're saying, here is a moment where the two are connecting. And this is true. Here's a moment where these two are connecting.
Because saying we're going to lose it, so there's the idea. When I ask, what do you think we're going to lose? There's two things. One is there's something that you and I would both agree we should try to keep.
Yeah.
And there are other things that you and I might disagree on whether or not we should keep it. Because when people say to me, oh, if we go down the road with Dostoevsky, that, if there is no God, everything's permissible. First of all, I don't think that's remotely true, because I have...
He makes a pretty vicious case for it, beyond good and evil.
So here's a difference. Peterson agrees with Dostoevsky that if we lose God, even just the metaphysical substrate of our ethos, even if ontologically Peterson can't say that God is real, if we lose this God, Dostoevsky's right, and that things will devolve into anarchy. And so Dillahunty says, I don't think so, and Peterson says, I think he's right.
And despite the fact that it sounds monumentally arrogant, I think I can demolish that case in about 2 minutes with his secular morality lecture. Well,
I think the first part of that statement is right, but not the second one.
So there's some status going here, and they're playing a game, and they're enjoying the game.
And we can find out.
And you can tell by their body language, they're smiling. Again, all of this is built in.
The thing is, there would be two categories of things that you and others might be fearful we would lose, some of which I might agree we should definitely not lose these things.
Yeah.
Others I might be absolutely fine with losing.
Like it that it's wrong to throw Sam Harris off a stage.
Yeah. I don't plan on doing that. But
well, we both
it did cross my mind at one point.
We both agreed that that was probably wrong.
Yes.
So, okay, so that's good.
And again, why the humor? Why are we joking? They are signaling back and forth here that, okay, we've got a difference, but the difference is okay. We can talk about this difference. We can live on the stage together, and neither one is going to throw the other person off the stage. Nobody's going to take a knife out and stab the other person. Nobody's going to threaten somebody's family. We are nested within these rules. And in many ways, Peterson is saying, Christianity is built into these rules. This is the metaphysic substrate of our ethos.
Probably.
Yeah.
And Dillahunty is saying, no, I can arrive at these rules without God. And Peterson's skeptical of it.
See, I'm a situational ethicist, and so there might be situations. If the stage were on fire, throwing Sam off would be the best thing I could do for him. So what do you think? What do you think we're likely to lose? What bothers you? And when you say metaphorical substrate, I'm probably just monumentally ignorant, but I...
No, again, this is part of the frame, because what you and I are doing right now is we pause it and we slow down. Again, if you read Alan Jacobs' How to Think, he gets it from other people, thinking fast and slow. Slow thinking is better thinking. Reason takes time. Our watchers need a little time. And so these two don't have the benefit of the time like we have right now, but this is what we're doing.
I really don't think I have a good understanding of what you mean.
Well, there's levels of thought. I mean, every thought structure, let's say, every belief structure is multi-leveled, like a piece of music. And there's the word in a phrase, and then there's the phrase, and then there's the sentence, and then there's the paragraph, and then there's the sequence of paragraphs within which the paragraphs are uttered, and then there's a broader context of interpretation within which all of that is interpreted.
And now if I have a conversation with Jordan Peterson about the word meek, I'd probably give this little lecture he's given right here.
And then there's our emotional and motivational similarity, and then there's our embodiment in the world. And all of those things are operative at all times when we're understanding one another. And as you move outside the realm of the linguistic, like the paragraph level, let's say, into the realm of the emotional and motivational and embodied, you also move into the metaphorical. And the metaphorical is structured in a particular way. And this is quite well documented by...
Okay, you move into the metaphorical. Why? Because C.S. Lewis points this out too. When you go from saying, imagining God as an old man to God as a force, you're just using another metaphor. Force is a metaphor from physics. What was I reading? Oh, I was reading. So I'm reading this book on Jung, which is an introduction to his work, and I was struck by how much of Jung's talk about the self, mapping the self, is just pure metaphor, and it's just one metaphor after another. And well, why? Well, because this is the way we can come into contact with things. If we say something is solid, if we say something is vacuous, if we say something has positive energy, it's all metaphor. And so what Peterson is saying is that as we talk about this stuff, we get to the metaphor, and the larger the complexity, the bigger the metaphor. And again, this gets back into the Peterson stuff about we act it out, then we see each other acting, then we represent it with our bodies, and then we represent it in language, and so on and so forth.
By the way, if you look at how the hemispheres interact, so the left hemisphere, broadly speaking, and I'm not oversimplifying this except that we don't have much time, is linguistic. But the linguistic utterances are understood in the context provided more by the right hemisphere, which is nonverbal and which attends to things like the music of language. And so at the bottom of a linguistic structure, there's something that's extra linguistic, and it tends to take form in metaphor and narrative and drama and that sort of thing. And the religious landscape is the narrative, metaphor, drama landscape. And if you disrupt it, then you blow apart the widest possible context within which the specific utterances are rendered comprehensible.
Now, again, it's important to sit down and think that through. Now, what did he just say? Well, this is, we live within these stories. Now, again, the two frames for Dillahunty and Peterson, they're both living within two stories. And I would assert that Dillahunty's story is people sitting in a movie theater looking at objects in space. Jordan Peterson's frame is people in a field of potentiality where action creates actuality. And Peterson is saying we live within these frames, and these frames give meaning, and these frames give ought. And when you lose these frames, you lose the civilization, because it's all built up on these stories.
Okay, so
and this hasn't helped.
Followed all that, shockingly. Anytime you were talking about signs and hemispheres and all this other stuff. So when you're talking about the broader context, if we lose belief in a God, we lose that metaphorical substrate that is the broader context in which we evaluate these narratives.
Yeah, that really grinds them into our bodies, that makes them things we believe rather than just think.
Sure, but
let that one sink in, because it's really important.
See, you didn't
what
just
is it
think,
about the
you
narratives?
didn't just think that it was wrong to throw Sam off the stage.
God, Sam's going to be pissed when he hears it.
Yeah.
Well, and this gets into Peterson's talk about post-traumatic stress in soldiers. It's not what soldiers see that causes them stress. It's what soldiers do that's evil. Now, why is that? Well, because it's one thing to look upon others as evil. It's a different thing to realize my capacity for evil. And that's why, again, if you listen to a lot of Peterson, he talks about when you go to Auschwitz, the predominant thing should not be those evil people killed the Jews. The predominant thing should be, I could have been the one to kill the Jews. That's what we should leave thinking. That's the lesson to be learned. I sent out a tweet the other day where I said, I said, what do you think of people who are always pointing out other people's sins? Now, when I use the word sin, I locate that in a religious atmosphere. And well, how do people feel about that? Well, you have the church lady, right? The church lady sits there and points out everybody's sins, and we don't like her. Says, well, how do you feel about people who are always pointing out racism and sexism? Well, in my Christian worldview, racism and sexism are sins. They're a particular category of sins. Well, we cheer people who point out racism and sexism. Oh, so how does that work? Well, here's what you learn if you spend enough time in a Christian community, hopefully. And here's what I appreciate about Calvinism, that we like to play a trick that other people are sinners and I am less of a sinner, or I am not a sinner. And what Calvinism says is that is a deeply dangerous game. If there is a sinner, I have to start with me. And Paul models this in the New Testament by saying, I am the chief of all sinners. And each of us should take that upon ourselves. Now, this runs counter to the contemporary narrative, which we say, no, I don't want to feel bad about myself. You listen to Tim Keller. Tim Keller would say, basically, your liberty is involved feeling bad about yourself in just the right way. We have to feel bad about ourselves to actually feel okay about ourselves. But it has to happen in just the right way. So this is where this is going.
Yeah. Well, that's okay.
Well, so
See, there's a difference between thinking something and believing it, because to believe it, it has to be thought incarnated in some sense. It has to be.
Now, again, remember, Peterson's standard answer, do you believe in God? It depends what you mean by believe, and it depends what you mean by God. Before we've been talking about God, now we're talking about believe.
When I talk about it, belief is this state of being convinced that a proposition is true or likely true.
That is this more objective, watching a movie theater, looking at objects in space. Is a proposition true? Now, Peterson's going to say that is nowhere near as relevant as what I act out.
Everything that I try to do, I tend to view in the form of propositional reasoning. So when we talk about the narrative...
Yeah, that's a problem, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah, well, you can't reduce the world to a set of propositions.
Why not?
Oh.
See, again, this is Peterson. Peterson is saying every day we are acting out things on the stage. Let's take the example of he and Dillahunty sitting on the stage. Dillahunty is saying, I can reduce everything we are doing right now to a list of propositions. And I think Peterson would say, first of all, you don't have enough time in your lifetime to list all the propositions that not only that we are acting out, but that we are nested within just in this moment sitting on the stage. Plus the fact that you will miss whole other ones. You will in fact need a team of really perceptive people. Tolstoy's, look at the size books Tolstoy writes. He's observing everything. Well, that's part of the thing about Tolstoy and these Russian novelists. They're so observant. Well, and so this is why Peterson blows him off. But I think Peterson would have been better to give him an example that you can't spend your life listing everything that this moment is nested within. That's how powerful actions are. That's why we have this little aphorism. Actions speak louder than words.
Look.
Show me something that is
no
true
problem.
In the world that is not a proposition. That
like
you
an
cannot
explicit,
put in
statable proposition?
Something that is demonstrably true that I could not put in a proposition.
Okay, put in or reduce to are two different things.
Oh, that's easy.
Okay.
Sure you want to go there?
I'm not afraid of anything.
Okay. Okay.
If I'm wrong, I want to know I'm wrong. But I'm trying to, for years I had this thing going where people would say, oh, and this is kind of what we're getting at from a different angle. I would say, they would be afraid of what we would lose if we lost religion. And I basically said, demonstrate to me any benefit.
Oh, you'd lose art and poetry and drama.
One thing you learn as a preacher is it's that the throwaway things on the side are really dangerous because you send things down rabbit holes. So now we're going down a rabbit hole. But now pay attention to what Dillahunty's motivation is. I can reduce things to propositions. Now, I hear this from Christians too. Often Christians want to take the Bible and reduce it to rules, or reduce it to propositions, or reduce it to systematic theology. Now, systematic theology is tremendously helpful. Why is it helpful? If you reduce things to propositions, you, in a sense, abstract them, and then you can manipulate them. And that's a really helpful thing. You can learn a lot through that. But you always have to bear in mind that it's a reduction, and that there are always elements to it that resist reduction, because none of us are smart enough to see all of the elements involved, which is why we act it out. And now this is why Peterson is going over into art, because he says basically what there is in a piece of art. This is what one of my interns once gave me. And so here's a picture of Jesus, and made up by, a bunch of different individuals. And so now, could you describe this piece of art in a sentence? Sure. Could you reduce this? Well, you could probably, and I know some of you are looking at this right now and thinking, this is heresy, this should be destroyed, not only by virtue of the different individuals that are in it, and here here on the back is all the individuals who are in it, but this is evil, and you could write a tremendous book about why this is evil, or why this should not be, or why this should not be on my wall. And the fact that this is on my wall, if someone would come into my office and look around, you could tell a tremendous amount about me. A picture is worth 1,000 words. I mean, we have all kinds of knowledge about this. And so Peterson is saying that you reduce it to propositions, you lose everything. Why? Because reality is so much richer than your list of propositions. Now, that isn't to say propositions aren't helpful and good and important, but they're insufficient.
Narrative,
Why?
story.
Are there no godless artists and poets?
There are artists
And now they're talking past each other again.
and poets who think they're godless.
Peterson is saying, this is the argument underneath the whole thing again. Peterson is saying, yeah, but it's embedded in them and they don't realize it. Because again, you've got the elephant and the rider, you've got the conscious self and all of the watchers beneath, you've got the embodied self. What does it mean to believe? Believe means you embody the thing. And the audience is incredulous. So, okay, the frame reemerges.
So we might have crossed over into a problem area, because
no doubt.
I can't draw for crap, although I do draw during the show. But one of the individuals who came to the show the other night handed me something that she had spent a great deal of time drawing. She's a wonderful artist. I'm very grateful to get it. And, while I pretend to read minds on stage, I constantly...
And here, again, is the frame. I don't pretend to read minds. What are beliefs for Dillahunty? He's a modernist in that sense. He's a materialist. Beliefs are propositions that I subscribe to. And again, I hear Christians make these arguments all the time. Beliefs are propositions I subscribe to. And Peterson says, along with Jonathan Haidt, that's the chattering rider. A human being is the rider and the elephant. And the rider doesn't know what's in the mind of the elephant. Now, you want to get into Jung? Jung's project was try to get into the mind of the elephant, and that's where you get into this very weird Jungian space. This is the conversation we're having.
Acknowledge that I can't actually read minds, so I can't tell you whether or not she actually believes in a God, but I can tell you that I actually don't believe in a God, and I could write poetry.
Like you do.
But you act like you do. Okay, here it is. Here it is, again and again and again. And if you understand the frames, you can understand this entire conversation.
Huh?
But you act like you do. That's why you didn't want to force Sam off the stage.
No, now you're making a claim. Okay.
And again, Dillahunty does not see what Peterson is saying.
So I'm telling you I don't believe there's a God. And your response to that is, I really do, because I have a moral sense. But my moral sense is utterly without any appeal to a God.
Explicitly.
Again, once you see this entire conversation is transparent. It's in fact predictable.
Or implicitly.
Maybe.
The f-
That's not so obvious.
Okay, it's really
See, because
it's
you
easy.
regard Sam Harris as an implicitly valuable entity, because otherwise you'd just throw him off the stage. And then the question is, well, just exactly why is he an implicitly valuable entity? What's your metaphysics of that?
I don't think he's implicitly valuable in the sense. And
now again, Peterson is saying this is a very long time. Okay, so let's imagine, and I use the illustration of the Jim Elliot story. Jim Elliot is a missionary. He is trying to reach this group of this indigenous tribe that's been living in the woods. And the thing about this tribe is that they kill everyone that's not in their tribe that comes up to them. Well, where has this morality arisen? Has this morality arisen through rationality? And Peterson is saying, well, again, where does he get Christianity? It comes in from below, and it reaches a stage of articulation found in these stories that we have in this book, and these stories get expressed in our culture. So if you lose the metaphysical substrate, you lose the ethos. And Dillahunty is saying, no, I got to this point, and I constructed my morality, and I just kind of did a little transition, and I replaced it now with my atheist morality. And Peterson says, no, you need a clean room. You need a clean room? Yeah, you need a clean room, and you got to go all the way back at least to lobsters if you really want to be without this. Or at some point, you're going to have to stop and say, okay, we didn't believe in God here, but the thing is, you'll never find that space.
I don't think he's implicitly valuable in the sense that the universe has implied that there's something explicit about it. For me, morality is far simpler than some people.
Now wait, you sounded doubtful about that. You know that, like,
maybe you're the
and with Peterson, it just kept his mouth shut. I'd kind of like to hear what Dillahunty wants to say.
Well, maybe.
Because you've already suggested that despite me sitting here and having talked about this for decades, that I don't believe in God, that I actually do because I have a moral code. But my moral code, which I was
more specific.
It's not that because you have a moral code. It's because God has built into your moral code in ways that you can't obviously rip out because it's more complex than the set of propositions that you can just delete a few of them.
I said it was because you didn't want to throw Sam off the stage.
Yes, but you didn't even attempt to ask me why I didn't throw Sam off the stage. Instead, you went to, why do you think Sam has implicit value? Because
he didn't ask him why he didn't throw Sam off the stage, because he can't talk to the elephant, and he's already talking to the chattering rider.
Okay,
it seems that in your narrative,
I'm willing
that's
to go
the
there.
Only justification.
Well, maybe you were afraid of being punished.
I think you no.
Oh,
I think you can have a perfectly acceptable foundation for secular morality, even if it fundamentally centers around selfishness. I'd rather not be thrown off the stage. It's in my best interest to encourage that sort of understanding in others, and therefore I will not throw him off the stage. I would rather not have my stuff stolen, and it's in my best interest to encourage others not to do that, so I will not steal stuff, and I will work with others to ensure that the people who steal stuff are punished. It is a virtually pragmatic moral system.
Okay, well, and that's a nice argument, and there's certainly validity to that argument, but the question is that really what's at work, or is that a post hoc rationalization by the rider of the elephant, rather than what's really motivating the elephant?
Why do you think it's not in your best interest to have stuff stolen from you or to be thrown off the stage?
Why is it not in my best interest?
Yeah. No, you don't get to think, oh, that's self-evident. It's like nothing's self-evident to the skeptic. Let's keep that in mind.
And again, Peterson's doing a little talking down here, which is interesting.
Oh.
And Dillahunty picks up on it right away. Now we're changing the game. We're not joking. We're not laughing. Peterson just got a little bit talking down. And Dillahunty's kind of like, oh, well, we're changing the rules.
Well, so...
And he's smiling. He's got the crowd behind him. We're in Peterson's town, but Dillahunty's got the crowd.
Because if we're going to get skeptical here, we might as well go all the way to the bottom.
and skeptical all the way to the bottom. What bottom is Peterson talking about? Well, he's going back in time.
Sam and I, the foundations, and we're not the only ones, but I tend to reference Sam just because if I say this, then somebody will say, well, that's exactly what Sam Harris says, except that, I was given this lecture before he wrote his book. But
a little bit more status.
But his book is better than my lecture, so read his book.
And some, and some humility, which is also good.
When I talk about this, I'm talking about well-being is the language that Sam uses.
Oh,
I don't.
Sad.
I don't care whether or not somebody else considers that morality. I would think at a minimum, would you and I agree that
that whole well-being thing, man, as a basis for a metaphysics, that's just a non-starter.
We're not basing metaphysics on it.
Sam is.
No, he's not.
Yes, he is, because he's out to maximize well-being.
You can take it up with Sam.
Well, okay, sorry. Do you think I'm wrong about that claim? That's what I understood.
I don't think Sam's saying anything metaphysical about it. I think so. Here's the thing: we are physical beings.
Well, it's his fundamental claim, so it's sort of at the basis of his ethic. And so he says, well, we should work to maximize people's well-being, or at least to. Well, he does a bit more than that, because he says we should minimize their suffering.
He's not minimize in this sense of simple consequentialism. Let me do this.
Okay.
We're physical beings in a physical universe, and the laws.
Okay, right here, we're going to have them roll out. We're physical beings in a physical universe. We're objects in space.
That dictate how things work in the universe.
Laws of physics dictate how things work. Are these laws eternal?
They are the ultimate arbiters of what is or isn't in our best interest, whether we know it or not.
How is a law an arbiter when you're talking about this?
So, for example, so far as I can tell,
then why do you need free will?
I don't think.
Why do you believe in it then? Why do you attribute agency to things if the laws of the universe can
get to that one point?
Well, yeah, but there was a contradiction that was confusing me.
Free will isn't relevant to this.
Why isn't free will relevant to this? Because again, his frame. These are objects in space. These are objects in space, and they function by the laws of physics. Free will isn't relevant because I'm sitting in a movie theater and I'm watching it. I'm watching this movie, and this is what's reality. And my basic question is, I want to know if there's an object called God. That's his question. Well, why is that his question? Because, well, why are you so concerned about this object? You're not concerned if there's an object called Brack's tiny conversation hearts. I should probably open this box.
It is if the laws of the universe are what are dictating what's good for us.
No, because if you chop off my head, that is clearly not good for me. And it doesn't matter whether it was an act of free will or if it was lawnmower.
It's clearly not good for you because you think you're valuable and worth preserving.
Yes.
Okay, that's...
Mind. Okay, again, we are the lawnmower. Okay, the universe works like a lawnmower according to these Newtonian laws of physics. That's his world. And then he introduces care, concern, mind, ethics, ought. Peterson jumps in and says, right there, that's not in your world. Your world should look more like, this is what your world looks like, but you're not accepting the yellow frame. You're only accepting what's in the box, and it doesn't work. But I don't know, Dillahunty's not getting it, and the crowd's not getting it.
That's the issue. Why do you think you're valuable and worth preserving?
Because I am the descendants of people who thought they were valuable and worth preserving.
That's the lawnmower answer.
And the ones who didn't think that have killed themselves. But this is not a statement about...
And Peterson hangs his head because you're not getting me. The lawnmower has no ought. When the lawnmower is going through the lawn, if there's a puppy in its path and the lawnmower is doing its own thing, it cares not for the puppy. Now you might say the lawnmower ought not to chew up my puppy. Peterson hangs his head because Dillahunty isn't seeing it.
This is not a statement about intrinsic value.
I don't know. Yes, I think
No,
it is. Okay, but I think it is.
Okay. The reason that we talk about this in terms of well-being is because irrespective of whether or not I care about well-being, there are facts about well-being.
Sure, let's hear them, man. Line those suckers up.
And again, if you understand the two frames, you can see why their emotional reactions are how they are right now.
If you chop off my head, it's in contradiction to my well-being. I mean, but the point...
No, I wasn't willing to grant that, actually.
Okay.
I'm saying that's a metaphysical presupposition. You're just saying I have to accept that.
No, I'm not telling you at all what to accept.
Sure you are. You're saying that your death would be wrong.
I'm trying to explain what my position is.
Okay, but you said that wouldn't be in accordance with your well-being. Okay, that's a metaphysical statement or philosophical statement. It's not an obvious fact.
That chopping off somebody's head is contrary to their well-being.
It depends on how you define well-being.
Now, this is again, chopping off someone's head is not contrary to their well-being. Well, situationally, we can certainly imagine a story where, okay, you're suicide. So someone comes to the decision that ending it all is in their best interest. That is essentially what every suicide is. Now, you might argue it isn't reasonable because why? Because they're being unreasonable. Well, but they are being natural because, again, the world is just a more complex lawnmower. The world is a more complex lawnmower with the illusion that it's self-conscious. That's the materialist world.
Sure.
Yeah, but it matters.
But if you define well-being as this glass of water, we're no longer talking about the same thing.
Well, you can define well-being. That's fine. That's what I'm waiting for.
This is what I'm... Well,
you can't do it. You can't define well-being.
Well, then why should I try?
Now, when he's saying you can't define well-being, he's saying you can't define it within this frame, within this objects in space. There's no room in this objects in space to articulate well-being because you don't have values.
I certainly can't do it if you keep telling me I can't do it.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I'll back off. Go ahead. I'm all ears.
So, the primary objection to mine and Sam's position that keeps coming back is, why should anybody care about well-being? And we both will acknowledge that this is, in fact, a subjective preference. There are people who are going to care about well-being, there are people who aren't. The second objection is that well-being is not clearly defined. Both of us have acknowledged this. It's not as if we're saying we have all the answers to how to go about living a better life. We're just saying that however we're going to define well-being, which is, I say you can start with a couple of foundations. You could start with death is preferable to life, but you don't get very far that way. And
Stop suffering.
Well, no, I'm saying you could.
Now, it's, again, you got to listen carefully. Peterson is saying death stops suffering, and
start with death is preferable to life, but you don't get very far that way because
yeah, you do. You stop suffering. You just die.
Yes.
Right, so you can start with the presupposition.
Except that when you're dead, you're not being, so there's no well-being.
No, well, that's...
And Peterson might say, well, you don't know that. Now, again, in objects in space, we've already decided that I have consciousness and my lawnmower doesn't. So if I do things that gives me the kinds of attributes similar to the lawnmower, I no longer have conscious. Again, you bring in Rupert Sheldrake and he'll say, well, can you really know that? Do you know that the sun is not conscious? And I think the way a materialist answers that is, well, it doesn't act like it's conscious. But once you take that step, you're over into Peterson territory. Because I say, oh, so now we're determining things by virtue of how they act within a system. And now we're into Peterson's world, where it's a forum for action.
That's not necessarily the
case. If we're looking for the best things about our life, you can't say death is better.
Best things. Okay, we got another value judgment in here.
Yeah, you can.
Well,
People
I
do
know
all
that
the
you
time.
can say it.
People do all the time. They do. No, look.
They can
I'm not
express
being
their
flippant
preference,
about
but their
this.
preference can be wrong. How can it?
How do you know what's wrong? Who's to judge? These are objects in space. There's no right or wrong. There just is. These are propositions. These are facts.
Possibly be better for your life if you're dead?
What if you are a terminal burn victim with cancer?
So this is the point that I was getting to. I am perfectly fine with the idea that for certain instances, there may be occasions that death is preferable to an individual over life. But when we're speaking in broader terms, if we're talking about let's create the best society we can, let's create the best quality of life we can for people, death is not that across the board. That doesn't mean that there aren't individual exceptions.
Now, we don't have to go back all the way to lobsters. We can just go back to pre-Christian societies. How many dead workers does it take to build the Great Wall? How many dead legions does it take to subdue Germania? How many people have made this decision all the time? Well, individualism, see, right? Well, what about individualism? Well, where does individualism come from? Jesus or Peterson would say individualism comes through Christianity. So if you want to have your value system that values the individual, you need a non-Christian clean room. And you might say, well, but there's other societies that haven't been as deeply influenced by Christianity. You'd say, yeah. And you'd also probably say, and they tend to be highly communitarian. Look over into a number of Asian cultures. Highly communitarian. It's the West that we have this individualism. Now, again, within Christianity, there's critiques of individualism. But Peterson would say Christ is the archetype of the divine individual. He's saying this is out of which your ethic is being determined. It's right there. And Peterson keeps pointing to it, but Dillahunty doesn't see it. Now, again, they're on a stage. Let's give them both some leeway, but this is why I slow things down and do these little commentaries, because Peterson is saying you have your individualistic you have your individual value of human life that is playing out here. Yeah, there might be some examples where we justify breaking that. But that value itself is constructed on top of Christianity. And if you want to take Christianity out of it, you're probably not going to be able to make it, because you can't make up a fairy tale.
So the foundations that I started with, you could start with death is better than life, but blah, blah, blah. If you start with life is generally preferable to death, health is generally preferable to sickness, happiness is generally preferable to sadness, none of these are absolute locked in stone rules.
But now pay attention. Everything Dillahunty is saying is already bracketed by individualism. Because if I am Emperor Nebuchadnezzar and the wise men are unable to discern my dream or even recount what my dream is, I am going to kill them all and kill all their families and take all their property. Now, we say that's not right. Why? Well, there's a telos. Nebuchadnezzar could say, it depends on, if my well-being is more important for the empire than any of these stupid wise men. I was rewatching Avengers with Ultron, that one. They want to save the town of Eastern European white people. Okay? It's going up into the... We have to get every individual off this rock. All the civilians must be saved. I was watching Justice League, and this family's escaping from the bighorn demon guy, and there's an apartment building where people are in. Superman breaks off the fight, runs over to save these individuals, and then goes back. Now, someone might say, wait a minute. You've got to beat the guy to save the world. No, we're going to prioritize the individual. That is built into the story. And Peterson's saying, that's right, it's built in all the way from the bottom here. And you're not going to have that story without Christianity. Dillahunty might say, there was no religion in that movie at all. And Peterson would say, the religion is built into that movie from the bottom. And you're fooling yourself if you imagine you're going to have the individualism that is governing your ethics without this.
Those things.
Okay, so if you start with them.
Yes, if you
So
start.
you're not skeptical about those claims?
Wow.
Well, I'm asking.
I came out and said that I wasn't going to be trying to straw man you left and right. And now every time I say something, you're like, oh, so you're not skeptical about that.
Well,
We're seeing a frame again. Before, Peterson was doing a little talking down. Now, Dillahunty's playing the victim.
I haven't gotten
No,
to
sorry.
it.
I'm not trying to attack you. I'm trying to understand.
And Peterson now takes the humble approach and says, no, I'm not trying to attack you. You don't have to play the victim. Again, well, where's all this from? This is nested in all this stuff. And this layer has been operational throughout the whole conversation, and probably no one expected Dillahunty or Peterson to play the victim. But here they are. Why? It's all built into this.
Where your argument begins.
Well, it seems odd that you would come out with, so you're not skeptical about that.
Well, that's a
While
question.
I'm on my skepticism tour, while I'm in mid-sentence to describe that these are the general foundations that you start with.
Okay, that's what I was asking. Those are, okay, so, but what you're saying, if you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not trying to be difficult. You're saying that those are...
Again, Peterson's being conciliar.
Are your starting positions. Those are the things that you accept.
I'm saying they can be.
Faith.
No.
Oh, you have a rationale for them.
Yes.
Now, it's interesting that, we're slowing down the video and we're looking at this carefully. I pluck out individualism. Is that the only one that's operating? No. There's many, many, many more. There's things that none of us are even aware of that are operating here, that probably some of you watching this slowed down like you're coming up with some, and you're going to put them in the comments section. Now, we might say, well, these are propositions. Well, sure, they're propositions, but there's way more than we can possibly name, and they're all at work, and they are working, and they're operating because we know how to act, even if we can't articulate them into norms.
Let's hear it.
You already have. Life is generally preferable to death because we're talking about our life. And
again, the individualist frame is in this. He's not seeing it, but it's there.
Death is generally not in the interest of the living.
The death of the Germans was in the interest of the living for the Allies, who bombed the heck out of their cities. The death of the Japanese in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was in the interest of the Allied soldiers that would not be killed by the invasion of Japan. Death is in the living all the time. Death is in the living of the old people who died to make jobs and room for young people.
It can be an exception. This is the point that I was getting.
That's not an exception. That's the general rule.
So you could start with those foundations. You could start with any three that you found. You could pick three arbitrary foundations. And the one aspect that makes a secular moral system distinct from religious pronouncements and divine command theory and those sorts of things is that the secular moral system has as its goal the object of getting better at getting better, which means if you find out that one of your foundations is wrong or in conflict with something else, you can now change that.
Pause. Before, 1977, the Latter-day Saints Church had a pretty specifically racist view of black people. They changed it. Why? The LDS Church has a built-in within their system prophecy. What happens? A prophet can come up and change a rule. Well, there you go. In fact, now you say, well, Christianity doesn't do that, and that's right. Well, why is Ross DeThought writing this book about divorce in the Catholic Church? Because he's afraid the Pope is going to change the rule. Well, this is how religions work. Religions change things all the time. Now, this is often an argument used against religion because religion seems to create a monolithic structure that will not change. Whereas, in fact, there's always stuff going on, change. The difficulty is change improvement or corruption? Now, Peterson's going to use the Old and New Testament. And we just had Andy Stanley made a comment about the value of the Old Testament. That's all over the news right now. And so now within the Christian tribe, we're going to have a fit about what Andy Stanley said because he's a celebrity preacher, and we're going to argue about that. These arguments go all the time and with respect to religion. So you want to talk propositions? This proposition, Mr. Dillahunty, is just plain wrong.
You could start with death is preferable to life, and then when you find out that it's not working that well, you change that foundation. I think that these foundations, based on the evidence of how people tend to live their lives and what they care about, are a good set of three. There could be better ones that somebody come up with. I'm open to revision on any of these at any time. But to say that I'm not skeptical about them is exactly the opposite of what I am. Because skepticism is about, I'm not going to accept something as true without good reason. And it's about being open to revision should there be evidence.
Now again, something built into when he says something here is a proposition. This is his frame. Objects in space. Propositions are objects. Here they are. True, false, true, false, true, false.
If you and I agree that we care about a good life isn't very well defined. And we may have different ideas about what good life is. But if we could actually just sit here and take notes, I think that we'd come across maybe a handful of things that we would agree would make for a good life. If we take those and compare them to the foundations of a secular moral system like what I'm describing, we can determine non-subjectively whether or not
non-subjectively
the list we've come up with are consistently approachable from that foundation. And we can do that for religious morality as well. The analogy that I've used in the past is, for example, a game of chess. There's nothing about the universe that requires that we care about chess or care about the rules of chess. The rules of chess are arbitrary. Somebody made them up. We changed them. We added en passant. We added castling. We did things like that. We have the rules of chess. We don't always know what the best move is. But if the goal of the game is to win or...
The chess thing is going to get into the rules thing, and that doesn't go very well.
The world doesn't seem to work that way. And I would say, back to the metaphysical substrate argument, you laid us forward a set of propositions, and the reason I was perhaps inappropriately torturing you about them is because there's a metaphysic under them. There's something that's driving you to put those forward as reasonable. You say, well, they're self-evidently reasonable. See, my question is...
I didn't actually say it, but okay.
Well, it's something like that, because you said, well, reasonable people could agree on these three or something similar. It seems to me that what you're saying is that there is a set of finite axioms that reasonable people could conceivably agree on, from which you could generate a rule-based moral system. Have I got that wrong? I thought that's what you said.
It's curious because I didn't say that, but it's very close to something that I have said in the past, which is, for any given situation, there's a finite set of actions that a person could take. And some set of those actions are better than others with respect to whatever the goal is. If the goal is to continue a decent life or improve the quality of your life, some set of one or more actions that you could take in this instant.
Now part of the difficulty of that is I decide that my life would be better if I divorced my wife. Okay? So I decide to divorce my wife. 10 years goes by. I look at the wreckage of my children. I look at the destruction of my financial situation. I look at both me and my wife having a series of not well-chosen relationships with other people. And 10 years from now, I decide, I was wrong. Should have stayed together. Well, here's kind of where religion is like a Ulysses contract. Religion is kind of like a Ulysses contract, and this isn't too far from Peterson's argument. I've been making this argument for quite a few years, actually. Religion, basically, you take the wisdom of past centuries and you consider that wisdom when you make your present decisions. Now, if the Bible says don't get a divorce, maybe I look back in another situation where I didn't get a divorce and I judge it would be. The problem I have is that we're all really bad at this. We don't really know the future. And so we try to make the best decision we can based on the available evidence that we have. And what religion does is actually build into it the wisdom of thousands of years of conversations and examples, and this is what comes up. And this is actually not too far from what Peterson has of all of this creatures with nervous systems and eyes looking at each other, and this then gets distilled into action, into drama, into story, into text, and governs society as we, within this society, continue to play around with it and tweak it, and at each tweak we evaluate the tweak.
Produces results that are better.
Again, better.
We would agree they're better.
We would agree they're better now. And again, this is where, okay, agree they're better now. And I just watched Franz de Waal Think Big Thing, and he was talking about, long periods of time. Okay, agree they're better now. Well, DDT was a good idea. In New Jersey, dumping dioxins into the waterways during World War II in order to fight the war effort was a good idea. Well, now to get all those dioxins out of the Passaic River, it's like, that was an incredibly bad idea, because do you know what it cost to try and clean up these sites? And if you had just kept the chemicals isolated in the first place? Yeah, but at the time it was a good idea. Yeah, at the time it was a good idea. And this is where you get into the Piaget. It's the time, it's for me and you and you and you, and it's me now and past and present, future. This is where we go along the axes and we say, it's got to be a good idea all the way through. And we don't know that.
If we were in that situation,
there must be an unconscious fantasy going on here or something, eh? Because we keep returning to that.
And it's fun. But one of the possible actions of this set of actions would be for me to throw him off the stage. Another possible set of action would be for me to, shield him. It is clear, and you can say that I'm just saying it's self-evident, it is clear that one of those is going to be more in Sam's best interest, and perhaps even more in mine, than another. That's all we're saying. We're not pretending remotely that we have the answer to every possible scenario, just that we have the foundational tool set that allows us to come up with the right answers. And we do this in opposition.
Yeah, but you also think that you can do that with a set of rules.
So first of all...
I actually don't think that's technically tenable. I don't think there's any evidence for that.
I don't know why it wouldn't be.
Now, Dillahunty hasn't heard Peterson's talk about rules and Piaget because, playing marbles, at a certain age, the kids can play marbles, but if you take the kids apart and you ask them, okay, what were the rules of the game? The kids can't tell you the rule of the game. A little bit later, they can tell you the rules of the game. A little bit later, they can, in fact, make up the game and govern the game by the set of rules. But this is part of Peterson's point. The game we're involved in right now is so enormously complex and so enormously large that we are trying to work this game of marbles out in terms of the developmental age of the children, but most of the time we're not doing it. We're just acting it out.
Well, you can't build expert systems, for example.
Well, you can't say that you can't because...
Well, we've tried for about 40 years with no success.
40 years out of 13.7 billion...
But he's the one that was just saying that we can decide the good right now in the moment. And for big decisions like a divorce or a job or a emigration to another country, we all know that we can't make those things.
And we haven't cracked it yet. So
now they're going to talk about computer stuff, which doesn't really go too far.
Telling the computer, don't play I talked about on a college campus last year is, if the government was running around dictating to people what their job was going to be, what their future was going to be, as some regimes have done, nobody would appreciate that. Nobody, almost nobody. I'm sure somebody would be, very happy, thank you. I couldn't figure out what to do. I'm glad I'm going to be, a brain surgeon, even though I don't know.
Well, I think I'm going to leave it at here, and because pretty soon they're going to run out of time, and they're going to stop the conversation, and I've repeated it again and again. Now you might say, well, why did you repeat it so much? Well, if it's boring to you, it's because you've already figured it out. If it isn't boring to you, like me, it's because I'm still trying to get it into my noodle, because this is so complicated that actually what I'm doing in talking to you, even though you're kind of abstracted into this YouTube cloud out there, I'm working this out. I'm figuring it out. I'm evaluating. I'm talking about it. And, It's through this amazing thing called the internet and videos of Dillahunty and Jordan Peterson. And I'm kind of out of time. I've got some things I've got to do. So I'm going to leave it here. And I think this is going to be the last one that I do on Dillahunty and Peterson conversation. I hope it was helpful for you. It was helpful for me talking my way through it. So thanks for watching.